from a design perspective, we've decided to focus on making Inferno to be a very lightweight and streamlined testing tool, so a tool that you can kind of get up and running with really quickly. We've also decided to focus very much on use case testing. So instead of looking at necessarily testing sort of vanilla FHIR kind of things, we're very much oriented towards use cases and implementation guides. And so when we designed the system, we wanted to make it so that you could test, different workflows and integration with other standards that might be out there. So it's sort of a kind of you can basically create all-in-one test kits around it. Now, our initial focus has been on the ONC 2015 edition Cures update API tests. And as Steve said, that's what we generally refer to as the program edition. So a lot of the way that we've designed Inferno is informed by building tests around that set of criteria, which you'll sort of see throughout. I'm going to walk through the tool a bit. But the idea here is that we'll also be building out tests for additional FHIR implementation guides. We've started doing that in a couple of cases. Ideally the goal would be to make it so that it's easy enough for people to use this platform if it makes sense for them to build tests for themselves. Now this is a big sort of topic area. The reason why we chose to focus on the 2015 edition Cures update is really it'll allow me to sort of walk through Inferno as a tool, so you see what Inferno can do. It's also an opportunity to provide a little bit more in-depth information on the set of standards and so implementation guides that you have to implement for this set of criteria. So we'll sort of pass through the whole thing. I apologize. It's hoping to have it be a little bit more hands-on, but you can certainly hop on the tool and sort of walk through using the sort of references that we have available. And I do encourage you to do that. So if you just want to hop on inferno.healthit.gov and you can navigate to the program edition, you can sort of kind of walk along with us. Now I do see we do have quite a few people in attendance. I'm sort of curious. I haven't done really the sort of the intent behind this tool is to make it something that's easy to download and run locally. The reference that inferno.healthit.gov is really more of a sort of a reference to check out. So I'm curious to see if there might be a little bit of slowdown if a whole bunch of people hit it at once, but we'll sort of see what happens there. But of course, you can run it locally if you visit GitHub. If you're on GitHub, and I assume most developers out there are, you can go download a copy locally, and we provide instructions. We do encourage people to run it using Docker. If you're familiar with Docker, it sort of provides a convenient way to minimize the number of sort of different things that you have to install. So everything's kind of packaged up for you. So while people sort of hop on and try that out, I just want to point out that there's a drop down on the page where you can choose a sort of a pre-configured server to hit Inferno up against. Obviously, it's, as a test tool, you need to run it against something. And so we do provide a reference server. It's kind of like a demo capability for you. But if you have a FHIR endpoint that you're looking to certify against the criteria sort of software, you can put in your own endpoint there, and maybe we can kind of circle back at the end if people have questions or anything like that. While people just kind of maybe hop on and take a look at that, I'm just going to provide a little bit more context from a developer sort of perspective. Steve, if you attended his previous talks, he spoke a bit about some of the criteria associated with the standards associated with the set of criteria. So specifically, there's you have FHIR, obviously, as kind of the base specifications, but the additional requirement is the US Core implementation guide, sort of on top of that, which constrains FHIR to to sort of a pretty to sort of a subset of clinical data. On top of that, and there's also the requirement for population level access, which is done through the bulk data IG. And so that sort of combination represents how you represent the data and how to actually access the data. So in order for, in sort of a real world use case for accessing FHIR, particularly around patient sort of data access, you need to have sort of standards around authorization. And that's where the Smart App Launch Guide comes in, and the Smart Backend Services Guide, which is a part of the bulk data access implementation guide. Now, so you have those two set of standards. Now, if you look at the criteria, there are a couple of other additional essentially rules that are layered on top of that. So for example, the Smart App Launch Guide, it lays out a whole bunch of optional core capabilities. The actual criteria requires all of them to be implemented. And there are sort of a couple of other additional requirements on top of that. So from a testing perspective, we test all three of these. Now, in addition to the actual criteria, there is a test procedure that is available and that Inferno tests follow. As you read through them, you'll probably notice that there is a fair amount of flexibility in how you can test to the requirements. And there is no, it's, as you walk through the sort of the steps, there aren't references to Inferno itself. So there's some flexibility in that. One other thing to note is there are a number of what are referred to as functional requirements. And that's where there are certain requirements that don't have have basically a standard associated with it, but you still have to demonstrate that you can support it. So for example, patient authorization revocations, so making sure you can revoke bearer tokens, for example, doesn't have a standard that is required as part of the rule, but it is something that you have to demonstrate. And Inferno tests basically, well, it does test all of everything here. In the case where there isn't a standard sort of backing it, we have sort of a kind of more of a way to attest that you've shown that this is that those things are capable. I did mention that there is a certain amount of flexibility. So Inferno, its test approach, and there could be sort of different ways to sort of walk through the test procedure, but Inferno's test approach is really to act as a very demanding single patient and multi-patient client application. So we test the integration of both the authorization pieces and the data access pieces, sort of an end-to-end kind of test that sort of runs through everything in a couple of different ways. We do one of the things we wanted to do is avoid redundant testing. So when you're looking at things from an end-to-end perspective, you can start imagining ways of testing every combination of authorization and sort of data access. So instead of doing that, we make sure that we check all of the required capabilities and sort of the most sort of standard kind of ways of approaching it, but we don't require sort of every combination that you try sort of over and over again. One of the things that Inferno does also is that it doesn't require a specific set of test data to work against. Instead, Inferno leverages FHIR's very substantial built-in conformance rules, and there's a whole bunch of things that we can check to make sure that the data is correct and makes sense and is internally consistent. And Inferno does a whole bunch of other things like tracks which must support elements have been provided. So you can provide realistic data and don't have to necessarily shove a whole bunch of information into one or two resources, but you can realistically sort of spread it out across multiple resources. And as I said before, Inferno does provide a sort of visual interface to log inspection or attestation when automated testing isn't possible. And with that, and I'm just going to go ahead and hop onto the site. I'm just going to sort of walk through everything and sort of just show you how the sort of the tool works, and then provide a little bit more information on some of the tests themselves, if I can hop over there. And hopefully this will sort of help people understand the different pieces of the rule and what's required, as well as sort of help show how everything is tested. So let me just double check to make sure that I think we should be still good. Yes. So if you just hop on inferno.healthit.gov, I'm just going to walk through the program edition site. And as I showed before, you can sort of choose the Inferno reference server, which is just a mock API that you can run up against. And really to get started, that's it. So you just provide a FHIR endpoint and click Start Testing, and then you're presented with really the main Inferno interface. This is more or less all you really have to know when you work through the app is this interface. Now what we do is we, in order to hit all of the different requirements, we basically walk through a number of more or less end-to-end scenarios to show all the different pieces. And those are represented in the little steps along the top. Just to give a sort of a quick overview, we asked the server to demonstrate that they can support the standalone patient app launch. We then asked the server to demonstrate that the patient has control over which data is shared, so to make sure that the user is prompted to only sort of choose which pieces of data to share. And then we look at the EHR Practitioner App sort of workflow, where a practitioner within sort of the context of their own working environment can launch an app. And then from there, those are the sort of the three main smart app launch kind of walkthroughs that we have. But then there's also, then we actually go into the sort of the real meat of the FHIR requirements with the single patient API. And that is where we do all of the FHIR queries that are required. We do all the validation. And we make sure that the FHIR API for single patient is conformant. We then move on to the multi-patient API. So that's where the population level services come in, and that's where the bulk data API is relevant. And then finally, we have, we've sort of walked through a number of realistic scenarios, but then there are a couple of sort of independent cases that we just want to check. So for example, we don't try out a public smart app launch in any of the first handful. But instead, we sort of wait till sort of the end and just do kind of a run through of all of them. Within the interface itself, so as the idea is you just kind of work from left to right, and then you get at the end you get a report, right? So pretty basic. Within each given step, we provide some information on what we're trying to accomplish. You can drill into the different pieces. So we try to make sort of the tests follow kind of logical flows that sort of make sense. And so, for example, in this one, we do a smart FHIR discovery. So we check their well-known endpoint and the metadata endpoint and check to make sure that there's enough information about the authorization server that we can automatically connect. We perform a standalone launch. We check the OpenID Connect, do token refresh, and then actually do some simple read of resources to make sure that we can access everything that we sort of expect to access. Now, to run the test, it's pretty straightforward. You click on the run test, right, and then you're given basically given a field to enter in any information that we happen to need for this set of steps. So again, we don't require you to enter in a whole bunch of information up front, but instead sort of wait until we need that information and then prompt the user for it. So in this case, we're essentially asking the tester to register Inferno as a standalone patient app. We expect to get back a client ID and client secret, a set of scopes that need to, the set of scopes need to meet a certain, they have to obviously be the right format and have the right content, but we allow the user to paste in sort of the way that the system under test wants them to, and then you just essentially click execute, right? So more or less straightforward. One of the kind of the real challenges in testing this is the fact that the Smart App Launch Guide, it requires a browser and a user sitting in front of the browser to actually walk through and test. So that's a lot more complicated than trying to, for example, just do a whole bunch of FHIR requests that you can sort of do on the server without any user interaction. So we built Inferno to be flexible enough so that you can do things like pause execution and redirect users and things like that. So it sort of demonstrates the sort of the flexibility that we built into the system. And since this step, what we're doing is really just demonstrating a smart app launch. Sort of if you're familiar with that process, you jump over into the system under, basically the system under test. You may or may not be asked to sort of choose a patient. And then from there, oftentimes you'll be given basically asked to choose which resources to approve or authorize. So Since we're just going to authorize everything in this scenario, we're asking, we want to see that we're able to access everything. You just sort of click them all off and you click run. So at this point, you've demonstrated something, basically a useful capability of the system. At this point, you know that a system supports a standalone sort of patient app launch scenario. We know that it can handle both authorization and authentication. And we've actually also, we've refreshed the token associated with it. So we know it can handle token refreshes. And we also do some simple sort of patient data access to make sure that the scopes sort of look correct, right? So we've already sort of walked through, kind of done one cut through most of the standards that are required. And as we just sort of continue forward, it's kind of more of the same, right? So I'm just going to quickly skim through and sort of describe each of these pieces. On the limited this limited app tab, an important part of this is to make sure that the patient has control of what data they're sharing. And so when you run this test, this one's a little bit different. We're actually asking the tester to tell Inferno which set of resources are going to be authorized. And basically when the tester is presented with the authorization screen. So right now we have patient, condition, and observation. So as a tester, I just have to remember that's what I'm going to choose. Now again, where we get the same sort of informational that, hey, we're going to be redirected. Click continue. Happen to be given a patient picker in that case, but now the point of this test is to demonstrate that this screen exists and that the patient has control over choosing which set of resources. Now, this is obviously a pretty gross UI that is technically compliant. I would expect that from a usability perspective, you'd want to sort of figure out good ways of presenting this to user in a way that makes sense. But the idea is that you have to have the ability to have this kind of functionality of choosing a subset of resources to authorize. So we click authorize after I did that subset, and if I sort of remembered which I previously chose, it should go ahead and redirect me back. And there's always, of course, the chance that that our server is somewhat unresponsive, which is always fun. Give it one more second, but if it doesn't, what I'm just going to do is sort of hop ahead. We'll see if it recovers. If it doesn't, what I did is I went through the whole application and sort of kind of filled out every step so we can sort of see it kind of in action. One thing, while we're sort of waiting for that, one thing I also want to point out is that we try to provide a whole bunch of information after a test has passed, basically, or failed, really, exactly what went on behind the scenes. So you can, within each one of these different steps, you can go in and view all the requests and responses. So a whole bunch of things that you sort of expect from a test tool, right? If there was a failure, we would provide as much sort of helpful information as we can to help you sort of debug that. So as you sort of use this tool in pre-certification activities, you can sort of figure out as easily as possible what's going wrong. One other sort of, it looks like we're kind of stuck. One other sort of piece is that if you kind of look across these tabs, we provide sort of an about section, providing a whole bunch of information. So within the application itself, we've tried to embed as much helpful information as possible, because really we're trying to make it as easy as possible to implement this. I'll just continue sort of walking through really quickly some of the other pieces, just so that you're aware. We don't have fortunately, we don't have a ton of time here, but the EHR Practitioner App is the part where we try out the EHR launch. What's a little unusual about this one is that when you run it, we do expect the user to navigate basically in another window into your EHR and then launch Inferno through that. And through that process, we can see it working. Within the single patient API, I know this is probably where a lot of people are going to spend a lot of the time, because as far as from an implementation perspective, because there are a whole bunch of requirements in here. In the test procedure itself, all the queries that are required are, it isn't given a lot of sort of visual weight within the test procedure because it's very well documented within US core itself. But there's a whole bunch of things that have to be implemented in order to be conformant. So for example, there are about I think 20 or so different profiles that have to be supported, and each one of those have associated with them a whole bunch of requests and responses. So for example, just opening up observation, respiratory rate tests. What Inferno does is it will do a search essentially by patient and code to sort of figure out what resources are associated with a patient that was authorized to access this information. And then what we do is we also will check to make sure that the results are consistent with what we searched for. So so it's for the right patient and right code. But we also will validate all the information against the FHIR specification and the relevant profiles if any exist. We also go through and check to make sure that all the references resolve. So we kind of go through and in the cases where you're referring to external resources outside of the resource, we will go and try that out. We also obviously will try out the relevant provenance searches as required in US core. Now, I think one of the sort of the questions that sort of comes up is around some of the resources that are required for US core, but aren't specifically called out in US CDI. And so how Inferno handles that is in those cases, we look for references to those resources in previous sort of US CDI mapped resources, and then use that to sort of figure out if they're conformant to these other resources. So there's sort of a number of kind of details sort of associated with the mapping between US CDI and US core. That, and I think one of the pretty decent approaches to just sort of try out the test in Inferno and to sort of see where those gaps are, and then use that as a way to sort of figure out sort of the best way to fix that. Just one other piece, and just a minute or two I want to spend on this. If you go under the other tab, that's where this is sort of these are all the different sort of grab bag of different requirements that have to be checked that don't necessarily fit into any of the some more straightforward use cases earlier. So this is where we try out the public client standalone launch. And in this section, since each one of these is run sort of independently, instead of having a run button here, we have kind of a run button off to the side where you can run each independently. Now, some of these require a certain amount of setup and have some sort of weird sort of behavior just because of what they're trying to test. So, for example, in the Smart App launch errors, the correct behavior is for the client app to more or less be stranded, and so we tell the user to expect that, and then more or less, if there's a button to click, so continue, and yes, the user interface failed. So that's a really quick kind of walkthrough of Inferno and the different pieces. There's quite a bit to it, and I hope people find that it's sort of helpful for them as they look to get if they're looking to seek certification against this criteria. This is helpful to basically help them get ready for that, because that was one of the main things we were trying to accomplish with this tool. The one thing I will sort of point out also is just from a general perspective, and kind of architecturally speaking, each one of these pieces, these set of tests that you see in here, essentially can be reused across different implementation guide tests. So the way that it's implemented is we have a Smart on FHIR set of tests that if there are other implementation guides essentially that require the use of that standard for authorization, then you can import the same set of tests into that context, and you can add additional constraints if there are certain requirements around that. So that's where some of the kind of the reuse happens. and it's something that we're sort of looking forward to sort of building up a good set of base, reusable tests that you can use across different implementation guides. So that's a very quick kind of whirlwind tour of Inferno. There are a couple more pieces that I wanted to just bring up really quickly before I open it up to questions. So I mentioned this early before, but if you would like to have test data, we do have places where you can download test data or generate your own test data based on Cynthia. So essentially, we wrote some tools that take Cynthia data, so you can generate a certain number of patients, and then what the tools do is they go through that population and look for sort of a small subset of the population where all of the must support requirements, so basically all of the elements that are required to be supported show up in that sort of small subset. So you'll find 5 or 6 patients that have all the required data elements, and it sort of fills in any gaps that might exist there. So I think that's a super useful tool to try out as you sort of prepare for certification here. And also the other point is from an installation perspective. I mentioned this earlier before, but as we sort of saw in this demo, the reference, the implementation that we have on inferno.healthit.gov is really intended for sort of demonstration purposes, and so it can get clogged up. So we do recommend people download it and run it locally if they're planning on sort of using it heavily. One other sort of, I guess, final piece here with regards to installation is that Inferno doesn't come with the required value sets and code systems, and as part of the code base, there's an extra step that you have to do to essentially download them from UMLS. We provide a whole bunch of helper scripts to sort of help you do that, but just be aware that if you download it locally and you want to do terminology validation, there is an extra step there. Do have one more slide really quick. We also provide if you're interested sort of broadly on how everything maps together and how all the requirements are covered, along with Inferno, we also provide a test matrix. So if you go into the GitHub releases, you can see all of the different tests. It's basically a spreadsheet that has all the different tests and it's mapped to the different steps of the test procedure. So we provide some visibility into exactly how everything is covered in case you are sort of curious as far as how we sort of piece everything together to make sure that there's a fully conformant system. And with that, so I have, I think about 5 minutes left. I think I'll see if they're open, if there are any other questions that anybody has, and I'll just sort of walk through some of and there are, so I'm just gonna walk through some of the questions, and I don't know if I'll get through all of them, but I'm happy to discuss more after this, obviously. So the first question is, can Inferno be used to test CMS final rule related IGs? The Inferno, we have a number of tests. I'm not 100% sure about which IGs are implemented in CMS, the CMS final rule. So I can't answer that question. I would guess probably not, but so we have to sort of take a look at that. Let's see, the second question, Rob, what FHIR IGs are you considering supporting directly in addition to US Core, Smart Bulk? So we are, there's been some activity underneath there. And it looks like Reese answered it. So yeah, so we've done some work with the Saner IG, if you're familiar with that, around COVID utilization around hospitals and stuff like that. That's sort of one of the first test cases we've gone sort of after that. We also have some IGs sort of in process that we've worked on around, for example, like Blue Button, and also around the Sync for Science basically suite. So we do have a couple of sort of in progress implementation guides. I think we're sort of in the process of figuring out what's next. You know, we've had a very heavy focus on US core and the certification criteria up to this point, but we're sort of in the process of figuring out what's next. Is Inferno for testing client FHIR apps or servers? So this is very much a FHIR server testing system because that's what's required from the certification perspective. And yeah, so inherently it's separated from that perspective. We sort of broadly, we're looking to make testing tools that are as helpful as possible. And if client-side testing is something that is really interesting to people, then that's something that we could potentially look at in the future. Although, I mean, one of the reasons why we focus heavily on the server side of things is to ensure that that servers are providing data in a conformant way. I think clients in many cases will. There's a little more incentive, I think, to have them sort of be, sort of be correct because they're consuming the data versus on the server side. But we'll sort of see how that goes. Let's see. So the client ID would have to be updated to a given system. Yes. So I really sped through it, but the idea is that you register Inferno as a client for the smart app and sort of the smart app launch sort of paradigm, and then through that Inferno acts as a client. So part of that is getting a client ID, and in the cases where it's a confidential client, a client secret. Yeah, and so we basically prompt the user as they go sort of through the process. One of the things I just kind of want to point out is that during the process of the tests, in certain cases, you can have different client IDs. So we do allow flexibility in our tests for essentially, you don't have to have a single app support both the EHR launch and the standalone launch. You can use different client registrations, and I expect most will. So there are some cases where we sort of lock the parameters from one test to another, but you kind of have to go through the process and you'll see where the flexibility exists. Any guidance on appropriate test data sets? Yeah, so if you go to inferno.healthit.gov and in the program edition, there's a tab there about test data, and I spoke about it a little bit. We use Cynthia because it maps very, very closely to this set of requirements, and it's a pretty cool tool to use. But you can also sort of kind of write you can sort of put together your own. But just keep in mind, there are a lot of required elements that have to be supported. So sort of writing them out by hand might be a little tough. And the last one that I have has Inferno been used much for IGs for non-US jurisdictions? So the majority of the work in Inferno has been around US core up to this point. We would love to have it have as broad applicability as possible. And that obviously includes sort of wider jurisdictions. So I think with that, I'm up with time. So thanks everybody for joining. I appreciate it. I apologize for some of the technical difficulties in the middle there and having to rush through things a little bit, but I would love to engage with everybody further on this in the future.
Rob, this is Melinda again. I thought that was fantastic. Sorry about the annotation issues. We've been having some of those on some of the other calls as well. There's something weird going on with the settings in Zoom, but does make it interesting. It was a great presentation. Thanks again, Rob Scanlon, our speaker today, and our introduction was on FHIR from Steve Posnack, so that was pretty fun. I really appreciate it. And thank you again to our moderator in Huva, Omar Shaker. We appreciate everybody joining today. Hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.